So take us back a few years. What were you doing that led you to think that you needed a graduate degree? Like, how did you see the future, and what made you realize that I needed some additional education?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. Thank you for asking that. So when you're in the military, and in my particular circumstances, I'm in a leadership position. I'm fortunate enough to be in that position. I've gotten very good at leading teams and being a part of policy, but I determined over the last few years that I would like to be one of the individuals that's actually helping create that policy and guide that policy, not just implement it. So I looked at where I was, looked at the end goal of where I wanted to be, and kind of worked backwards from there. And one of the things I noticed was most of these folks in these types of positions that have not just a degree from a random university, but usually a highly esteemed degree from an institution like Brown or Harvard or an insert institution here of your choice. And then I started to kind of look around and search and see what program would work for me, being able to continue working full time while earning a high leverage degree. And that's where I discovered the MTL program through Brown.
Thanks, Dan. Let's go to Pat. Often people like you, Pat, I mean, to generalize a little bit, they come out of nuclear power school, very unique set of educational experiences in the Navy and just operational experiences. And I often see them, they might go into defense contracting or they might go into nuclear energy. You didn't. You chose a different path. So take us back a few years and tell us about how the transition went for you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and it's great to be here representing MTL as a graduate. Uh, when I was in the military, I had a very fortunate experience where I was young and on a very operational submarine for a 3-year period and got a lot out of it, but never grew that desire to command a submarine and make a career out of it. So after separating, 5 years in, I wanted to do something completely different. And really my main criteria when looking for new opportunities was to get back to the Boston area where I went to school. And I wanted to have the live downtown, work downtown kind of life experience and was able to achieve that. So I ended up working for a small, 30-person company in the hedge fund space on the software side of that industry. Had leveraged networks from my undergraduate time to get there, and in that experience learned a ton about financial services, as well as operating a software product and delivering that to a customer. And I took more of a liking to the latter, which led me to the transition over to PTC, which was the last 5+ years of experience focused on product development, within a, long-standing publicly traded company, delivering software to, companies that build discrete physical products or maintain discrete physical products. And that's where I got, the fortunate opportunity to kind of overlap my experience, supervising, propulsion plant maintenance, in addition to delivering software to firms who were performing similar tasks.
Let's take the same question over to Barry. So I think of our guests here, you really kind of stayed within your swim lane of expertise technically. So within that journey, what made you think that you needed a degree that focused on leadership? I mean, clearly you have the technical education behind you. You're, an expert cyber. So how did you feel the MTL degree with its focus on leadership was complementary to those skills?
Oh, yes, thank you, Peter. Um, so I was at a point in my career where I had transitioned off the military and I was supporting the Department of Homeland Security as an information system security manager. And we began to take on a lot of different projects. And I was tasked with being the leader of a lot of smaller teams that started to become larger teams and a larger personnel and a lot of more responsibilities. And I began to quickly realize that the military way of leadership doesn't always translate completely to the civilian side because a lot
Mhm.
of my coworkers, some of them are military, but some of them were not. And my traditional way of leadership, or how it was, taught to me from my military experiences, has always been a set, structured, format. It's like task, this is how we accomplish it, and that's it. But not everybody works the same way. So I really wanted to, I think, get a better job, do a better job of understanding people and understanding how to communicate with people to achieve this, a common goal. And I started to search programs that could help me learn about that. I looked at psychology. I looked at all sorts of degrees, and I found stumbled upon this program here, and it kind of was perfect, especially in the structure of the program, how it's laid out, the format, but also the fact that is technology based, which is my background, and then it was intertwining how to become a better leader within the technology field. It just felt like I created the program myself when I read the description of it. I was like, wow, like this is exactly what I'm looking for. I needed to really make myself get out of my comfort zone and kind of formulate how I wanted to be a leader. Because I don't think I really took the time to think about that until I ran into these challenges at work.
A few years ago, for your time, we had a guest speaker here in the program, Mike Connor. He's a founding CEO of a small defense contractor, Thayer Mahan. Mike was a three-star submarine officer. And when he was asked the question by the students about leadership, he put it pretty bluntly. He said, you can't walk into your office and say, "Hey, I spent 30 years on the pond. I know I know what to do. Just shut up and take orders," right? So like that just doesn't fly, right? You can't apply that kind of mindset to a civilian world. And in his words, he said there were a lot of senior execs that would flame out, right? Because they didn't make that transition. And it's a very conscious discipline to make that transition. I often see people from all kinds of walks of life, not just veterans, when they transition, they think an MBA. That's what I need. I need to learn how a business works. But none of you chose that route. So, Pat, why did you not choose that route?
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. One, in my case, again, pursued higher education for, what was it, 6 years after I had transitioned out, and kind of felt that that like full-time 2-year program, like business basics, had kind of passed me by, and I had a better gauge of the career I had ahead of me in computer software, in particular in B2B enterprise software, and what I wanted to learn. And I thought the curriculum within the MTL program, fit those needs very well. In addition to the program format, allowing me to continue to work while pursuing the degree program, and getting it done on a condensed timeline.
Dan, same question for you. Why not an MBA?
Yeah, that is a great question. And to be fair, there are quite a few parallels between the MTL's curriculum and the MBA. But I will say, with this program in particular, you're looking at it through a technical lens that did not see, at least at the time, an MBA program that could deliver the same curriculum with a technological focus to it. Um, I would also say that, again, just to reiterate Pat's point of some of the MBAs, they required a lot more residency that just wasn't for me feasible at the time. So we do get to have 2 residency periods at Brown and graduation as well. And you still get that tight cohort experience, but I wasn't traveling to Providence, Rhode Island every weekend or every other weekend like some of the EMBAs have to offer. And this isn't to disparage anybody from going out and getting an MBA, but in particular for what I needed and what I was hoping to get out of the program, the MTL delivered both in the format and in the curriculum. So that's why I ended up choosing MTL over an MBA.
With a curriculum that's built kind of in three broad areas around strategy, technology, leadership, with business basics kind of woven in there, our students tend to come wanting to execute in one of those areas. Like there was something about it that they felt, I need to strengthen that toolkit. Was that true for any of you? Was there a piece of the program that just really resonated strongly with you? And if so, what? We'll stay with Dan.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say for me personally, I did not have a lot of experience with the financial workings, the inner workings of a company or an organization. I also really appreciated the strategy management courses and entrepreneurship, which I was lacking in, and being able to take a lot of that information and apply it real time. At the time, I was working with a startup and in my position at Cisco. And what I was able to see was I could take those weaknesses and be able to see in real time that these aren't just theories; these actually work in practicality. And for me personally, that was a really satisfying part of the program.
How about you, Pat? Is there an aspect, of course, a faculty member, something that really just you was particularly valuable for you?
Yeah, the I'll say too. There's a course on leadership and professional development that I just felt gave me the space to think back on my military experience and like what worked and didn't work, and to give me more confidence to apply certain techniques to leadership in the private sector, which is great. The one I think about almost daily is the psychology of decision making. Again, like really had me reflecting on the way decisions were made, underwater, and allowed me to draw parallels to how to either make decisions effectively myself or to set up somebody else for success in making, an informed, decision. So those are the two that I would highlight, although I enjoyed every course in the program.
It's interesting you mentioned the psychology of decision making. So for those of you online, we did a webinar a few weeks ago with that professor, Steve Sloman. He has a new book out. Um, and we were talking about the ways in which human beings formulate plans and make strategies and decisions when the playing field is less than clear, right?
Sure.
And I'm sure Pat can attest that looking in a radar scope, sonar scope, like that just it just gibberish, right? If you don't really understand, even then the playing field is incredibly vague. So I find it fascinating that you find that kind of connection between being under the water of what the signal to noise ratio, how am I making decisions? And those decisions are big ones, right? These are really important, valuable decisions. So those of you that are with us, we're happy to send you the recording with Steve. Barry, how about you? Anything, courses in particular that just really grabbed your imagination?
Yes, I would say the ones that I could immediately apply to my work from like the next day, literally were Professor Barrows and of course Professor Tenenbaum. Oh, they're teaching about leadership, communication, and executive presence. These are all things that, like I said before, in the military, you're taught one way. It's structured, it's focused. It's like this is what it is. My rank is higher than yours, so you have to listen to me. You don't really take any reflection of like, how am I as a leader? How am I being perceived? What is the perception of when I walk into a room when people want to work with me? Things of that nature. And I think that those courses in particular really stood out to me, and it's something that I also constantly think about, as well as decision making, kind of like Pat said.
I've got one more set of questions for the three of you, and then we're going to open it up to questions from our audience in a minute. So it'll be the same question for all three of you. We can stick with Barry. What advice do you have? So we've got quite a few vets in the program over the years. We're in our 10th year. It's a very diverse cohort, people from all across the country, different industries and verticals and backgrounds, some in STEM, some not, lawyers, sometimes medical professionals. Um, and some of our folks in the program are not vets. They're active. They're active military. So what advice do you have for somebody who's thinking about this program with a DoD background? Be they be transitioning, maybe like one of you has done, or you're staying in defense. Why, how would you think about this program? What advice would you have for them? Barry?
I would say this is something I wish I would have done. I got a lot better at it as the program went on, is that you don't go into any course assuming that you already have it figured out. Don't go into it thinking that, just based on the title of the course or what you have used previously and what you thought that worked. It doesn't. The frameworks that you're going to receive are things that a lot of times that you've never heard of, never dealt with, and the insight you're going to get from your classmates and from the professors is things that really is eye-opening. It's going to really change how you think and how you deal with situations and encounter problems. So just really going with a clean slate and an open mind. And it may be a course like, for example, the climate course, something that you didn't necessarily think that you would find interest in, or something that you may have thought like, oh, this is going to be completely different, like complete 180. So just going with the clean slate and open mind.
Pat, how about you? What advice might you have for someone who was in your shoes a few years ago, transitioning or staying in the DoD space?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of pursuing like a graduate degree or in general, when you get into the civilian workforce, at least, like there's no incorporated continuous education. And I started to feel that really lacking in terms of my stacking up the days and weeks and months where, in the military, yeah, you learned on the job, but that it felt like no matter where I was, there was some sort of like continuous education program. And this provided that. Specific to this program, Peter mentioned it, but as either an active duty military member or a veteran, you're not going to be the only one in the MTL program. I think it was, I don't know, maybe a quarter of our cohort had military experience, and that was great. Um, and another thing that was touched on previously when Peter asked me about, pursuing an MBA, while this program, almost everybody was working while doing it. So you also won't be alone if that's of interest. And while, there were only a couple of residencies throughout the course of the program, they had a massive impact on our cohort's relationships while online. So they're extremely valuable. I personally, in retrospect, am grateful that I landed in a program that had a residency model, and if I were to pursue another one, it would be a hard requirement.
That's great. Appreciate it. And in fact, we're thinking about adding another residential component to the program to really deepen. You all work in teams. I think that's a very natural fit for people with your background to what it is to work in teams, and we take that as a key part of the curriculum. You'll work with teams, you'll build your network, and you'll be on teams with diverse people, right? People from very different industries and backgrounds. So the last question to Dan: what advice would you have for your former self?
Right, and that is a fantastic question. I would say two things. First of all, let the program challenge the assumptions that you may have when you walk in. I believe Barry alluded to it earlier, and Pat's touched on it as well. But for instance, in my case, somebody who's been in a leadership position in the DoD for a considerable amount of time, you may think you have it figured out. Well, when you start doing the communications courses or you start to do the leadership courses with Ed Barrows, you quickly realize I'm just scratching the surface and I have a lot to learn. And that's great. You can work with that. But when you think you have it figured out, we can't work with that. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is a lot of times veterans and currently serving members really do they sell themselves kind of short. And they think maybe this is kind of out of reach for me and somebody with my background. Maybe I didn't grow up with super wealthy, or I had my adversity I had to overcome, whatever the case may be. And I would suggest never self-eliminate. You have a lot of valuable experience that you bring to the table. And from my experience at the MTO program and the faculty and the other students within the cohort, they were very receptive of our thoughts, our feelings towards things, bringing our experience to the table and comparing and contrasting that to maybe their lived and shared experiences as well. It really did enrich the conversation, and that's not just lip service. And we all learned something from one another. So those would be my two biggest takeaways, at least from my end.
Well, you touch on, I get the question all the time from prospective students about like what makes a successful student. And you've all, it's so heartfelt for me to hear you say it, that to have an open mind, right? Like you are here to learn, but you're also here to contribute, right? And those, I think, are the two things that make a successful student is coming in with an open mind that you do want to learn, but because you're going to work on a team, and I use the expression iron sharpens iron, we choose our candidates carefully. You also have to bring something to the game to contribute to the growth of each other, to have that commitment. And that's certainly something that vets do um, probably better than any of our other students, honestly. Okay, Emma, any questions for our panelists here?
Yes, it looks like our first question that came in is asking about the program format and if the program is compatible with, your typical 9 to 5 work schedule.
I'll just tee that up. You can figure about 20 hours a week of homework. It varies by semester, summer being the lightest, but does any three of you want to talk about how you were able to balance, I think Pat's coming online, balance your school studies with your personal and your professional lives?
Yeah, if Dan and Barry don't mind me going first, it was definitely like the number Peter just stated was intimidating going into it. I wasn't sure again what the rest of the cohort situation was going to be, and like I said, I think almost everybody in our cohort was working full time alongside of this. I had a 1-year-old child at home and another one on the way that came 3/4 of the way through the program, and it was a lot certainly, but having this thing to go to that was enjoyable and, as Barry put it, kind of just opening up your mind to the curriculum, I think was actually helpful in kind of having a successful year in 2025. It didn't distract me from my work. In fact, not as a brag, but there was a promotion and then a new role shortly after that was a promotion on top of that. That all kind of, I think, was fueled by participation in this program, and the program was not a distraction. So, you're gonna have to buckle up, but it's certainly doable.
I think we just published on our website. We did a study, a kind of longitudinal study of the 10 years of our alumni, and I think the number is 78% of our graduates received a significant promotion within 2 years of graduation. So you can look it on our website, a great track record on the ROI. Anybody else want to say a few words about work-life balance in the program?
Go ahead, Barry.
Barry?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, kind of piggyback off what Pat said. It really is doable. It can seem definitely more stressful at times. There are certain, terms that are uh, way more rigorous, but I think another big part for me, at least, was leaning on my group, having that communication with each other and really trusting each other. Like, hey, I have family stuff going on this week, or work's really stressful. I won't be, as you know, I won't be there as strong as you need me in some areas, but I will pick up the slack when you need me, vice versa. Everybody has each other's backs. I think that's really something that benefited us, really having that good communication structure, being open and being readily available for your teammates, I think really was extremely helpful with that as well.
Fantastic. Emma, another question?
It looks like our next question in here, how do you see the CCP project playing out in your career now that you've finished the program?
So CCP is the shorthand for the Critical Challenge Project. It's a 1 semester experience in the fall. It's led by our academic director, Larissa Levinton, and most students choose a project that's related to their employer. Not everyone, but it's your project. You can think about it like a mini thesis. So it's your topic, your idea, your project. We give you a coach or a mentor to help guide you in the thinking of the project, not in its execution. And people choose it for lots of different reasons. I think for veterans, they often choose a topic that helps them with the transition. That they want to take their former background, demonstrate a new body of knowledge and an expertise in an industry, civilian industry that they want to move into. But again, it takes every different form that a student can imagine. So that's a great question. Dan, how about you? What was your CCP and what was the value you got out of it?
No, fantastic question to whoever asked that in the chat. I'll say this. I was one of the outliers that Peter just alluded to, and mine was not internal to my work at Cisco, but it was instrumental as I am still in the National Guard, it was instrumental in some of our planning processes. So I went a different route and I built a product essentially, which I did not have experience in before the program. And throughout the cohort experience, throughout the curriculum, you really develop a sense of system design thinking and product development and management. So I applied those principles and created a product to help with communications planning in austere environments. And I won't go too technical or deep in the weeds on this particular call, but it's one of those areas that I've experienced a lot of friction with in the DOW of how do we actually plan. How do we plan and execute communications in environments that are not very friendly to us? Okay, so with that lens, I developed a product that made it very easy and gathered stakeholder advice and took that feedback, iterated it, and continuously made a better product to where I do use it with my group in the National Guard today. So very, very fruitful. And it's something that, later down the road, looking to potentially patent on the Cisco side as well. So kind of a dual purpose for me personally.
Well, there are two words that I always use to describe this program: transformation and impact. So
Yes.
the curriculum, the experiences, being on campus, the hybrid nature of it, all of these things lead to a transformation within the student. We've been talking all afternoon about that, about being open to that transformation, but having clear goals, like entering the program with a set of objective, your objective. What do you want to go as a result of this program? And you've all done a wonderful job of articulating it. But Dan, in particular, I love how you took that CCP and now other people are feeling the impact of it in a positive way, right? So that's the transformation and impact because you're leaving the program better leader, more equipped, and one of the things that the key objectives that we're looking for in all our students is that you have the impact that you envision for yourself. We don't care if you want to become the CEO of General Motors or Cisco or whatever, that's great. If you want to have an impact at the company level or the platoon level or in the neighborhood level, it's up to you. We just hope that you have that vision about having that impact in the people around you. So I so appreciate your story of the CCP. Pat, how about you? CCP story?
Yeah, my CCP was focused on my work at the time, and again, working for a large software company with a globally distributed workforce, and the challenges with collaboration and decision making from like the software product manager's perspective. Um, Used it as an opportunity to dive into like the world of AI agents and how to make basically my knowledge of the product and position on our product strategy available at all hours. And I think it a couple of things. One, it uh, made me interested in getting back to a small company and reflecting on how my skills are more valuable in that arena. And I made that transition a couple of months ago. Um, but it also kind of made me kind of really eager to dive into the like the workflows that could be optimized with the AI wave and think critically about how I can you know not kind of get stuck in my ways. And in a big company, it's easy to kind of get stuck in your ways. So the only other thing I'll say about the CCP is that I chose to do it within something relevant to my current company that did make it easier in terms of executing some of the required assignments, just given the kind of dependency you have to reach out to knowledgeable people who are outside of the cohort. And I think there are a couple of different courses that require you to do that, such that you're not just like reading a paper and writing a reflection in your own little bubble. And again, I'm saying that as a positive, CCP being one of them.
Um, Thanks, Pat. Barry. How about you, CCP?
Yes, so I had already had the idea for what I wanted to do with my company. I had absolutely no clue the route I was going to take. And my CCP project changed probably like 5 times before I settled on really a solid topic. And I wanted to take my company, which is Citadel, which is a government contracting, cybersecurity, and technology modernization company, and find a way to employ not only the best of the industry, of course, but also give opportunities to underserved and minority youth within Prince George's County and the Washington, D.C. capital region. And through doing cold call outreach for my project to conduct research, I was able to get connected through someone from the Board of Education in Maryland, who is a executive director of a nonprofit organization called Because I Can, who runs an entire organization teaching minority and underserved youth in Prince George's County, Maryland, technology from AI to coding to everything. So it was pretty much a match made in heaven. The pipeline right there was created. Now, the students that he teaches that are about to graduate high school, I will be able to employ within the next couple of years. And it's just like without the CCP project, that connection would not have been made. The formulation of the entire idea of the project and making it come to life would not have been possible without me, having the tools and the frameworks given in the project of, okay, this is just the way to go about conducting your research and having that, aligned up in a way to get me thinking a certain way, it wouldn't have come to life. So without the CCP, my company would not be where it is, and I would not have formed the relationships that I have with people throughout, the area, so seamlessly.
Another beautiful description of impact. For those online, CCPs tend to take one of three forms, generally speaking. Entrepreneurial, I think Barry's is a good example of that. And entrepreneurship, it could be for a lot of our students that are, rising up in a large corporation to build a new business within it, a new P&L, and we've seen that many times. So entrepreneurship can be, again, building something within an existing organization. But we've also, particularly with vets, we have a fantastic story of a husband and wife. He was a MARSOC, and so he's a Marine Raider. He and his wife both came to Brown and they built a whole new company. They came here with that one mission. I want to build a company and I need the program to help me do it. They used our Nelson Center of Entrepreneurship to help support them in their mentorship of it, which is a resource available to all students. And they're executing on that. They're getting government contracts. It's a beautiful story. Another form of the CCP is thought leadership. So people that, again, they might want to pivot their career and they want to show a prospective employer that they have an expertise in a particular realm. And then the last form, I think some of you have talked about a little bit, maybe Dan in particular, I'll call process improvement. And these are tip projects that we often see with students that have a strong technical or a STEM background, how to improve something. So communications in the field amongst, your fellow operators, or it could be different systems in a company that are just disaggregated and they could work much better together. So again, from that enterprise point of view, how to stitch things together and optimize. So those are sort of three forms that we tend to see in the CCP, just so the background for everyone. Emma, I guess we have time for another question or two. Anything else from the audience?
Looks like our last question in here is asking about outside of leadership and management skills, what are the most valuable applied skills that you acquired from this program so far? And how does the coursework connect to real world impacts?
Well, that's a great question to wrap up with. Anyone want to take that one? We'll go all three. Anyone want to jump in first? Pat, okay.
Yeah, and I'll focus on the first part around, like, other than leadership and communication, what were the beneficial aspects? I think there were a few in the kind of like analytics and visual storytelling realms that I thought were hugely valuable and pushed me beyond like my kind of like experience in like retroactive analysis of data, as well as how to, present, a scenario, kind of like what, so what, now what framework I think we talked about a couple of times, getting into even, you know, chart formats and, PowerPoint visuals. It's, I guess, suited for kind of the modern way of interacting, you know, either async or via remote, that I found very beneficial and learned a lot.
Dan?
Yeah, very well said, Pat. For me specifically, even though those were some of my two biggest takeaways, are the ones that are excluded from this particular question, I would have to say the communication piece. You are assigned a coach. A lot of people, it's hard to find this information online at times. You are assigned somebody who's going to work with you one-on-one, dissect how you communicate with other people, and then you're going to watch that footage and they're kind of going to pick you apart. And you do this in a group setting, so everybody gets to kind of poke fun at one another, and it's all in good fun. But you really do get to see kind of your flaws and how you communicate with others and how you can improve. And they get you there through one-on-one sessions. You don't have to be in a leadership position. You don't have to be in a management position to communicate effectively with others. It is a very underrated skill, in my opinion, and it will unlock doors that would normally be closed to you if you cannot effectively communicate. So that would be my biggest, one of the biggest takeaways that is not leadership or management related is definitely the communication piece.
I think over the years, students invariably cite that course and its teacher, Barbara Tannenbaum, as having a lifelong impact. I get emails from students that graduated from the program 8, 9, 10 years ago that they still hear her voice in their head. Barbara's been at the school for a long time. She teaches in the undergraduate students, and I'm told that her course is one of the most popular. Of 10,000 students on campus, she has a 2-year waiting list to get into her course. So you were all fortunate to have her, as an integral part of the curriculum. And I think one of the things that we often get the question, like, a degree in management versus a degree in leadership. And my sort of thumbnail to answer that question is leadership presupposes a vision about where you want to take your organization or your people that are around you. And if you can't persuade them of that vision, you're not going to get very far. So that's why the persuasive communication class is a cornerstone of the curriculum. We'll wrap up with Barry. Barry, questions over to you.
Yes, kind of going off of what Pat and Daniel both said, I think that Um, communication was such a huge part of why I wanted to do the program, but also what I got out of it because I immediately received that mass amount of self-reflection, the time to really take to figure out, what are the gaps and areas that I can improve myself professionally and personally. And I have actually seen the results, and I've seen how I am perceived. And my wife has told me like, "Wow, you're such a much a better speaker. It's easier for you to talk to people and easier for you to listen." And a lot of times when we hear communication, it's all about me, me, me. How am I, projecting myself? But communication, a big part of that was listening, and that's something that I definitely needed improvement on, and how to be an active listener and how to really understand, the meaning of what people are saying, not really necessarily just their words and just revamping my entire mindset, that transformation you spoke about. I think communication, persuasive communication was definitely huge for me.
That's a beautiful way to put it. To be a good communicator, to be a good speaker, you have to first be a good listener. And if you've ever taken a course in negotiation or just read that little book, Getting the Yes, it's not about you, right? It's about you, the other person. It's about finding common ground, about understanding their motivations. And if you can see that, then you can persuade them, right? You can find common ground. Brown has been a supporter of the military and its veterans for its entire existence, so 256 years or whatever it is. And I'm proud to say that we continue that tradition with all of you. We support the GI Bill and the Yellow Ribbon. And I cannot thank the three of you enough for being with us today, and of course, for your service to our nation. And with that, I wish you all the very best. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you online for being here today. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.